Hey everyone, my name is Will, and I like to talk about music. Today, I'm going to be doing a ranking of the legendary electronic duo consisting of Sean Booth and Rob Brown, Autechre. Now, Autechre are a extremely famous electronic music act, perhaps only in the underground circles though. They are oftentimes more like scientists than they are also excellent musicians. I hope that you are already familiar with their very mind-bending discography, but if you aren't, I hope you use this guide as a way to pinpoint you to which records you should head to first, not only in terms of my own ranking that I have chosen based on progressions and how these sonics have held up over the years, but also maybe where to start in terms of what you have covered in the electronic music genre and what will align with your taste the best. It has been a while since my last video, but I'm really excited to get back into this one with a worst to best of Autechre. It has taken me quite a while to get through all of these records because there are a substantial amount of music in their discography, and they range from being an hour long to 8 hours long, with spanning over 4 different LPs once we get to the NTS Sessions. So this was really a journey, a trip, but I will say it was always very memorable to see how they've evolved over the years and when they've been more progressive with their sounds and on the cutting edge. And I'd say for the most part they have always been on the cutting edge and really on the progressive side with a lot of the elements and themes in their works. So once again, to go through my criteria of what I'm really looking for in an Autechre record, I'm looking for one, just great sonics, great production, and great programming, which the duo has been famous for being just craftsmen on. I mean, really some of the best in the entire genre, even more than the more mainstream acts of Daft Punk, for example. These guys are a little bit more abstract in the samples that they're pulling from and the synthesizers that they're pulling from as well. And the effects are really extraordinary, sometimes verging on more fragmented as opposed to their more groovy, pulse-centered earlier work. So I'll go through all of that in the ranking as well. And 2, I'm also looking for the progressions. Now these progressions could also be on a concrete, more smaller micro level, or they could also apply to the entire record. I'm looking at flow, I'm looking at how these records hold up over an hour and plus in runtime as well. Without further ado, let's get into it. I would love to know your ranking of these records as well, because there are many great records in the Autechre discography, and I'd love to discuss all of them with you in the comments. But first, let's get to number 15. So at number 15, coming at the bottom, I have their most recent record, Plus, from 2020. Now this is a record that came alongside Sign, which is pretty much presented as a sister record, but I think that's pretty much a weird comparison to make, considering that this just feels like B-sides from that same era. And I think even one of the members, I'm not completely sure on this, you could fact check me, but one of the members even said this should have been released as an EP as well, and it was a little bit weird that they chose to also release this alongside it, because right from the opener, which happens to be only 2.5 minutes and some of the most scattered and fragmented material from this era yet, it's clear that the band did not completely put as much thought into a lot of these experiments as what they did on Sign. And I do also have my problems with Sign, which I will get into quite soon. But with this record, it's only intensified, as I think they go for a slightly darker sound, but not completely effectively in that region yet. On this record, they're really just kind of experimenting, improvising a little bit, but none of it comes to full fruition because the progressions are just lackluster. And sometimes I think they're even non-existent. There is a few longer scale tracks that do have their intense moments to them, certainly some blood-pumping beats in the mix as well, but when we're talking about just full-scale ambience, I think Sign does that better. In terms of the melodic synthesizers, it's much more entrancing in my opinion. This just feels like it's even more reserved and conservative in terms of what they're trying to do with their melodic elements. They go for a little bit more of experimentation and the dark sides and their percussive elements on this record, but none of it feels coherent enough to really make for an interesting experience overall. So once again, I don't really have much to say about this record, but I'll just say it probably should have just been an EP. There's no reason to release an entire batch of songs from this Sign era that is practically the same length and, you know, not even nearly as interesting as that record. And I'm not even a big fan of that record as well. If you're into the Sign era and they're more ambient stuff, maybe you want to get into this and check this out. But for me, it just happens to be slightly weaker than what they delivered on that album. That is coming in at the bottom place for that reason. Now, coming in second to last at 14, this may be a sort of surprising placement for some people, but I don't really think so. It's Oversteps. Now, Oversteps is their first full-on detour into ambient music. Sure, there are some percussive elements to this record, but it mainly stays very centered in these very atmospheric, creating this ambient environment that they had previously experimented with on records such as Quaristice. That opener is beautiful and gorgeous. The synthesizers on that record are great. But I feel like on this record, they feel much more hollow, in my opinion. A little bit more of a shallow texture overall. While they've, you know, pretty much contributed to some very great ambient works in the past, it would be a little bit concerning about them taking it to a full-length record, and I think this kind of proved that maybe they weren't ready to do that and didn't have the full resources available to them, at least musically, to really get a full, compelling ambient work out there, because I think a lot of the progressions on this album also are not incredibly interesting. I do think the opener is a clear example of a track that, you know, starts off the album with a very alluring sound palette. It brings in some percussive elements as well, but it doesn't really develop or build on these things into anything incredibly interesting. And once you have a majority of tracks that are doing this for a full-length album, it just leaves me with an experience that I'm not completely sold on, don't find the most rewarding experience, similar to a lot of the ambient points from the Sign era as well. I think this kind of falls into their more melodic stuff that is a little bit simpler, and I think just not really in their bag in terms of being known for this very complex and abstract electronic group. I think a lot of this stuff just doesn't really feel like they're at home in their environment, and what happens is just not some of their most interesting work, in my opinion. At the same time, while I would recommend this to someone in that ambient genre, at the same time, if you're into works like Brian Eno or Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, those are incredibly full of, much more depth and emotion than is going to be exhibited out of this era of Autechre's discography, in my opinion. So at number 13, I already touched on it a little bit, is Sign. This was basically the sister record to Plus, or I guess it was released before it, but this is basically a similar aesthetic, and I tend to have similar problems with this one. But I will say that this is far more enjoyable, in my opinion, on a textural front. I think the melodic elements and the ambient elements of this record are much more intense, much more visceral, and also just much more vivid in terms of what picture they're trying to paint here. Certain tracks like the opener, as well as Metaz Form 8, bear with me with a lot of these track titles as we get into them, because they are ridiculously hard to pronounce, and really there's no rhyme or reason to why they chose them at all. Anyway, they bring some impressive and entrancing synth work to the table on cuts like this, very deep, low synth basses that I find, very gratifying in many ways. But at the same time, a lot of these tracks just reach a certain peak, they reach a certain level of intensity, and never really develop them into anything further. They kind of just trail off. While I think certain moments like that on other records, such as Chiastic Slide, they actually built upon various other factors when you're comparing them to other tracks in the track list as a whole. They were at least expanding on them as far as a long-term progression goes from track to track to track. Here, I don't find that at all. These are all very concrete, set progressions, and even though they sound nice while they're on, I don't really think that they brought the most dynamic or interesting changes of intensity to the table as well. So I think that while this is a much more simplistic album that I find is very cool, and I can appreciate what they're doing in terms of making the more abstract elements and presenting them in a much more simpler format, I think the lackluster progressions once again just made me come away from this album just thinking it was okay. At number 12, this might be the first big real shock to some people. I have the debut, Incunabula. This is definitely a record that I can appreciate for its time and really for the scene that it helped flourish and somewhat pioneered a little bit. I think as far as ambient techno goes, there are some very strong highlights on here. As far as Bike goes, I think that's one of the most recognizable and iconic synth lines as well. Of course, if you're into this more groove-centric era of their discography from their first 3 records or so, before we get into Repetae, which is much more experimental, but if you're into just their much more simplistic ambient techno stuff, as well as Amber, which I'll get to later, you will definitely appreciate where they're coming from in this album, just kind of making these moody, vibey dance cuts, but they're not really, I guess, vibey in the way that you could play this in the club and dance on the dance floor to this. This is kind of like the smoky, dark alleyway of the dance floor, I guess. A very, I wouldn't say stripped back, but what they're calling IDM, which is a little bit of a useless term, could literally mean anything. It's a little bit vague, but as far as a descriptor, I could see what it's trying to say in terms of it's a little bit more low-key, it's a little bit more abstract than what is typically presented in a EDM type setting. You get this on a track like Wind, which feels like you're at the center of some tornado or some extreme storm, but it doesn't completely reach that boiling point of intensity that I think it is really looking for. And I would say that for a lot of tracks in this album, even some of the classic tracks such as Bike, which I think once again has such a memorable synth line and has such a iconic intro as well, but it doesn't really flourish into anything that I think is really extraordinary or reaches a certain level of intensity that really pulls me in as much. I do think it also just becomes a little bit repetitive because of this reason, and a little bit overstays its welcome. And I could pretty much say that for the entire record and for a lot of tracks on here as well that sound nice while they're on, but just simply overstay their welcome. However, I will say Bass Cadet is a track that is a complete exception to this. Absolutely love the beat on this one, and the synth lines are just so ear-grabbing and so memorable. I think it truly is one of the classics in their early era of their discography for sure. Be sure to check out tracks like Eggshell and Doctrine, which also have great beats presented on them as far as progression goes, and as far as my own taste, looking for something that's a little bit more boundary pushing, a little bit more experimental. This just feels a little bit tame in comparison to all that. At number 11, I have elseq, which is the 4-hour-long behemoth of a record. Not quite as long as their 8-hour-long project, which I'll surprisingly get to later. elseq is 5 parts. All of them are about 50 to an hour in length. The purpose of this album is kind of to show you these different electronic atmospheres at different various angles. You start off this track list with a very hazy, kind of washed out track that is, incredibly bold and incredibly visceral right off the front, and then you contrast that with C16 Deep Thread, which is far more just groovy, centered, visceral, and just straightforward in terms of being a little bit more stripped back on its harsh textures. As we move forward into the entire work, I don't think this concept completely pans out all the way. I think as far as elseq 2 and elseq 3 goes, they start to let their ambition get the best of them, especially with tracks on elseq 2, which are completely longer, only containing 3 tracks, but one of them happens to be 25 minutes, and this track features some crazy kind of metric modulations, a lot of polyrhythmic stuff that's going on. And as far as this track goes, I think that while a lot of its rhythmic textures are engaging, I think they often let that large scale get the best of them, and they're not really thinking about what the most compelling or most atmospheric textures are going to be. So I think in some respects, in some pockets of this LP, they are sacrificing their ambition over things like textural clarity, as well as some more interesting progressions. Because I think even on that long 25-minute track in elseq 2, I think a lot of that sounds a little bit more improvised than I would like. I'm okay with improvisation, actually, but when it's this middling and seems to waste more time than it needs to, that is a track that kind of falls into that category for me. There are certain cuts on here like that sound almost like a conventional club banger if it was sent straight to hell. As you go into elseq 3, it is a little bit more of a continuation on elseq 2, but now lacking a little bit in its progressions. I think especially elseq 3 and elseq 5 tend to be a little bit more lackluster in terms of giving more changes in intensity and changes in dynamic levels. I will say elseq 4 is an exception to this, which I think on its own stands alone as a great project, as well as elseq 1. elseq 4 is just clearly the most intense, balls to the wall record on this album, but it does contain a lot of moments of beauty as well, probably the most varied and dynamic of the 5 parts of elseq. And it really just shows them turning things up a notch from elseq 2 and 3, which I think were a little bit uninteresting, even though I enjoyed them to some degree. I think I generally enjoyed elseq quite a bit, and I think elseq 1 and 4 are pretty great, and you should definitely check them out. If you're not willing to go into the entire project, once again, I would highly recommend elseq 4 as well as elseq 1. Once again, the main problem I have with this is that when you're going to sustain a 4-hour long runtime, you have to have pacing, and when we're treating this as a complete work and not just 5 separate albums, this kind of loses its grip. I don't think that there's a clear coherence to the tracks that unfold on this album. There isn't really a lot of attention paid to what tracks are flowing into the next and why. And once again, I think that's pretty much why this lands into the bottom half of this list, even though I still recommend a lot of tracks from it. Quaristice is an interesting album. This album also has some dense instrumentation, but I would say it's a little bit less on that just intense in your face side and more giving you these short cuts that kind of encompass a lot of different styles and moods in their discography. So even if I have a place in the bottom half of this list, I think it's a very enjoyable album. And I think in a general sense, this is kind of a culmination of everything Autechre has to offer. I would say it's almost in the realm of a Beatles' White Album type of experience. Not that it has anything to do with Beatles' White Album or is similar to that record in any means, but I do think, as far as, kind of giving you different various styles of things across their entire discography, sure, some tracks are not gonna, live up to the hype of others, and I think that's pretty much the weakest part of this album, but at the same time, the tension that the contrast between these tracks play against each other, from that ambient intro to some of the other tracks which sound like they incorporate some kind of video game samples or something. It's just a very exhilarating and intense experience that I think is really essential in any listening to their discography, even if it happens to be maybe not one of their strongest records. I think in that sense there's just like a very chaotic and intense swinging back and forth to this record, the same kind of effect I would get from Aphex Twin's Drux in a way, even if this isn't quite as intense as a contrast as that between those ambient and drill and bass cuts. But there is a similar sort of quality, even if it's a little bit less intense. I love some of the accessible ambient techno beats, such as Tankaturn, which seem to take a lot of their earlier elements of their discography in a much more refined and nuanced direction. At the same time, I wouldn't say that a lot of the sounds and elements in this record present their most boundary-pushing or mind-blowing work, but I do think that as far as a record that is following up such an impressive statement such as Untilted, I think it's a really good, somewhat transitional album that sees them transitioning a little bit more into their ambient elements. They're not quite there yet, but on certain tracks like the opener and the closer. there is a certain level of more ambience going on in terms of the atmospheric synth work, and even just some of the ambient techno cuts as well show that they're starting to lean into that direction before they go fully headfirst into it on Oversteps. While there are a lot of great cuts on this record, once again, because there are so many and because some of them are more underdeveloped than others, some of them happen to be weaker than others, but I do mess with the core of this album, and I do think it is a very impressive statement from them, even if it lacks a little bit of coherence. And I think the flow across the entire track list could be a little bit better. Some of the payoffs on some of these tracks could be a little bit stronger. I think this is one of their more accessible records, and if you're not completely into abstract electronic music or haven't had much experience in this genre yet, I would actually recommend this as a pretty good starting point into the discography before going into some of the experimental records that preceded this one. At number 9, it is Amber. Amber is a very significant point in their discography, even if it just feels like a continuation of what they're doing on Incunabula. But that being said, I think that this is a far more dynamic record than Incunabula. It's a far more refined album than Incunabula. Sure, it pretty much does the thesis of Incunabula and what that record was setting out to do, but I mean, my god, do the progressions sound so much more dynamic, so much more interesting in terms of what they're adding and building upon on this record. The grooves, I think, are even stronger. They really have a sense of crafting an earworm at this point in their discography, even just from rhythmic things, just like the syncopations on the first two tracks of this record, whether we're talking about Foil or Montreal. That synth line right at the beginning just completely grabs your attention right away, and the percussion elements are starting to also sound much more crisp, much more refined. And I think when we're looking at these two records that are pretty much their ambient techno era in their discography between Incunabula and this record, Amber, I think Amber is clearly the one that has the highest regard when put into the context of today's electronic scene. I think far more interesting things have been done with both of these records, but that being said, Amber is the far more interesting one than Incunabula. I think this is a really, really strong piece of ambient techno. I go back to a lot of tracks on this album, and it's really one of the most chill, kind of just more ambient records that you could put on into the background. It's pretty hypnotic, it's pretty mesmerizing at points, and it works well for a much more in-depth listen and also just a more background listen as well if you're just wanting to chill and vibe along to this record. As far as the approach goes, I do think that there is a lot to be explored. There's a lot left on the table. They made a pretty good, solid piece of ambient techno with this one, and I wouldn't say there's many bad tracks in this record, or even any bad tracks in this record, but I do think that in terms of the sonic textures and the experimentation that could be involved, I think they just prove that they have so much more left in the tank as far as their groove-centered production goes on records like Repetae. But if you're looking for a record that is adjacent to the band's early meditative textures, this LP is definitely where you want to go. At number 8, we have Draft 730. Now, up to this point in the video, I have talked about some levels of experimentation, but this is probably the hardest we have gone into the experimental era of the Autechre discography. I think Draft 730 is one of their most fragmented albums. It's one of their most challenging albums, and that is a very surprising thing to say, considering that I came from Confield before this, because I listened to this discography in chronological order, and coming from Confield, I thought that I had everything that I needed to really grasp and get down to the core of what these records were all about. This is a very hard record to unpack in many ways, but there are more accessible cuts, such as Repetae, whatever. It is truly one of the most haunting, harrowing beats in their discography that completely morphs itself into something much more fragmented and hellish as it goes along. Really one of their best tracks of all time. And also 6LECR is one of their most head-nodding but also aggressive sounding beats just to start off a track in their entire discography. The opener, Xylem Room, has some very interesting primal rhythms whose percussive elements just jump at you right off the bat, completely lock you in to what this record is really going to be all about. Their intense focus on this new fragmented style, while it does represent an interesting point in the band's evolution in a second half of their discography, I also think that in many ways it comes at the cost of some of the progressions on this record feeling a little bit less interesting than they could be, and also just some of the textures, I think, being a little bit more hollow and less expansive than there could be. I think that's my one main critique with this album, even though it's landing towards the middle half of this list. This is Autechre, and they have a lot of fantastic records, and I would also say the same about Draft 730. This is an album that is definitely to check out if you're just into their most technical and experimental avenues of their entire discography. Do not start with this one if you haven't checked out any of this band's music, because it's a pretty heady one and it's a pretty dense one, but it is surely worth checking out when you're ready. At number 7, I have Exai. Exai is from 2013, and it represents their longest record to date as far as full-length LPs go, which would of course be overshadowed by the 2 works that came after this one. But as far as this goes, this is still a massive work. It's 2 hours long. It is 2 discs of just pretty much mind-blowing electronic music. It represents some of their more accessible elements on tracks like Bladalores, and at the same time, the opener is read as some of their most experimental stuff, especially coming off of Oversteps. It's a complete change of pace, and it was really mind-blowing that they came back with full force in this record. And in my opinion, I think it's just them getting back to form. I wouldn't say it's completely expanding all of these different sounds into something that's entirely new for the band, but I will say that the production that they do give on here is just so textural. It's so layered. Once again, getting back to Bladalores, that's one of the best tracks in their entire career. Everyone loves it for a reason. That triplet hypnotic groove is stunning. The outro, the ambient synths really give a nod to tracks like All End, which will come later. But when you go to some of the other highlights on this record, like Rexon, for example, they also give some more accessible elements. I was actually shocked at the intro of Rexon, which sounds like it could freaking be a hip-hop beat at one point. I was like, really, Autechre's going there. They're going to this very conventional realm, but it's very interesting and could pretty much fit on a modern hip-hop record. But this is just a great culmination of their more experimental sounds, with sounds that could probably appeal to a more accessible EDM-centered audience. And therefore, I think it may be helpful to digest a few records from that experimental period before getting into this one. Once you do all that, you're not going to be disappointed with this record. It's 2 hours of some of the most cerebral, some of the most visceral, and at times just some of the most vibey tracks of their entire career. Untilted at number 6. One of the most insane, just bad shit insane records in their discography. Grooves on this thing are fantastic. The instrumentation is just incredibly dense and visceral. When you're just looking at the tense display of energy on an opener such as LCC, very aggressive and propulsive beats in the first half, contrasted with these more laid-back, kind of swing-like grooves that almost point towards a certain funk influence as well. What they're doing is top-notch in terms of production, in terms of programming. This is really their most groove-oriented and pulse-centric record since Chiastic Slide and Repetae, and really just their most immediate. It will just burn holes into your head as far as the rhythms go. They're so catchy and so memorable. Look at the 12 or 14-minute track that closes this record, titled Sublimate, as well as even some of the deeper cuts in this album, like the trees. I just find myself going back to just how groovy and how hypnotic and mesmerizing those rhythms are. It's arguable, once again, that this new style that they're embarking on is not a complete radical change from what they've done earlier on more pulse-oriented and groove-centric albums. What they are doing is, pretty much just giving me a very exciting, very intense, and very visceral Autechre record. With that being said, at number 5, Chiastic Slide. So if you decide to go through the Autechre discography, as I did in chronological order, you'll find that Chiastic Slide is probably the record that stops you in your tracks a little bit, and there's a reason for this. It's that a lot of the cuts on first listen I thought lacked a lot of substantial progressions, a lot of changes in intensity that really could pull me in, but this record is really the first in their discography that's not only about visceral grooves and visceral rhythms that are going to tap you in, but immersion. I think you could argue that Repetae does this a little bit, but that record is pretty much substantial in terms of providing more elements as the track goes on that are offering some more changes and more stimulation as it goes throughout. Chiastic Slide just kind of ruminates and meditates on these very sometimes simple but sometimes complex beats. I think some of the most depth in the entire Autechre discography. There are even some more ambient tracks in the back half that tend to play with this idea of transforming the cuts in the first half, because as the Chiastic Slide form goes, you pretty much have A, B, C, C prime, B prime, A prime. You're basically reaching a focal point and then reversing the various sections back, but transformed in a different way. It actually creates a more long scale progression. That's what I was really lacking in terms of when you view Chiastic Slide as not concrete track by track, but rather as a holistic experience. The entire thing really comes full circle and has a much stronger impact as a whole, perhaps than the cuts themselves, and I think that could come as a detriment to it in certain pockets, and I do think they will expand upon a lot of the experimental textures that they already have a very solid footing on in this record. Chipiter, the opener, of course, has one of the greatest grooves in their discography and one of the most mind-blowing metric modulations in the midpoint of the track, which pretty much sets up the thesis of the album being a chiastic slide going from one point and then coming back. And then you have the closer like Nuane, which is just also full of grooves, full of great synth lines. I can't get that synth hook out of your head once you listen to this track. And I think the emotional high point of this album, Chichlet, is pretty much the climax of the record emotionally, and one of the best tracks in their entire discography as far as the synth work on that track, debunking the myth that Autechre doesn't have any humanity. I think in terms of even their more mechanical stuff, I think the kind of societal themes that they're almost pointing towards in terms of the contrast between the mechanical and the human already offer a lot of human insight. But even when you look at tracks like Ray, when you look at, once again, tracks like Chichlet, these are tracks that are incredibly founded in strong human emotions, a lot of great art. It just isn't possible without any human emotion. And I think that to say that Autechre doesn't have any is a complete myth. Once again, just to wrap up about Chiastic Slide, it's a very just striking LP that kicks off a new, bold era for the band. It's a little bit of a transitional record, but for a transitional record, I mean, damn, does it really hold its own ground, and is it a very impressive statement in its own right? And number 4, I have the NTS Sessions. This is probably the placement where I will have to simplify 8 hours of music into a few minutes, because this is literally 8 hours of music, and I'm not gonna lie, as far as I took multiple listens with the other albums in this list, I listened to this once, because it is 8 freaking hours. My god, wasn't it an experience? It surely was. It surely was. For what I was expecting, it's actually a little bit more accessible. You think 8 hours and you just do not even look forward to it, no matter how good it's going to be. But going on a plane ride and starting this thing off with NTS Session 1, damn. Some of those brutal, visceral, hard-hitting, percussive elements in their entire discography, and I think some of the most wide-scale sounds they've ever produced so far. In fact, the production is oftentimes so damn good and impressive that it sounds like more of a visual project than an auditory project. I feel like I'm literally seeing things when I'm going through a lot of these tracks. That's how freaking insane it is, especially going through NTS Session 2. Some of the more ambient and even the more stripped back cuts on this record play a lot into the tension between various tracks in the track listing. So, while this thing can be very excessive, I do think a lot of the tracks comment on each other in very interesting ways that provide a lot of tension and build up into various different points in the records as well. And yeah, I mean, did it have to be 8 hours long? Maybe not. I don't really know if I'd want to cut anything out specifically, because it's kind of the point. Immersing yourself into these beats, resisting that urge to skip forward, get to the point where this record is so hypnotic that I feel like I've lost control and autonomy over what I'm listening to, and that it's really listening to me. Like, it's the other way around. It's really just taking control of my brain and then just like smashing it in all various directions. So as you can tell, I actually freaking love this album. I would say NTS Session 4 was probably the strongest for me, mainly due to All End, but also some of the ambient cuts on that record are also just really, really freaking astonishing. Somehow they barely lose the intensity throughout this 8-hour experience. Take it track by track and just see how the sounds wash over you. I still have to formulate a lot of my thoughts on it, and I'm sure some of them will slightly change over time since I only had time to listen to this once. It's 8 hours long. As far as my first impressions go, it was very, very compelling, very gratifying, and surprisingly works far better in my opinion than elseq. It really focuses on long scale progressions and pacing as well, which I think that record severely lacked in certain pockets. And then number 3, Repetae. This is what I see as the start of classic Autechre. Right away, first track dial, boom, you already know this is going to be freaking insane, and it already is. I mean, that sound, just to put it right off the bat, you know it's about to be one of the most rhythmically engaging and groovy records yet. And that's what they deliver on this album. Just groove after groove after groove, banger after banger after banger. There really isn't a beat on this thing that I don't love. Maybe the track Letterel I think is a little bit on the tame side, but other than that, this track list has a lot of variety, especially with a track like Overrand, which is the penultimate track, which offers just this very immersive, ambient, but still pulse-led soundscape that is the perfect way to set up the closer RS80, which I also love for its just driving percussive rhythms. I just see this as them really building upon Amber and Incunabula in many ways. What they did on those records was very fascinating, but what they do here is even more visceral, it's even more intense, and while I wouldn't say this is their most boundary-pushing or their greatest record yet, I think for the style, it's pretty much the most you can milk out of doing ambient techno or whatever they call IDM, because they might even classify their next albums as IDN as well, which are just completely different in so many respects. It's crazy that, as far as electronic goes, the difference between Repetae and their next few albums is still classified as the same band, the same genre, and they're just completely on different freaking spectrums and universes. But that being said, of course you want to check this one out, and honestly, as a first-time Autechre fan, I think it's fine to start here. I mean, this is just banger after banger. I mean, there's really nothing else you could want. As far as just straight-up surface-level stuff goes, this is pretty accessible for them, and of course, I think it's a top-tier album in their discography, landing in my top 3, Repetae. LP5, the band's 1998 record, is a masterpiece of electronic production. Really an expansion on all the themes that Chiastic Slide was building towards. Taking the contrast between the mechanical and the isolated, and contrasting all of those themes with the more emotional. It really sees someone trying to conform to the systems we have built around us. And this is where I kind of come to a conclusion that, with my own interpretation of this music, I find it very gratifying looking at, someone or a system and trying to balance between the more mechanical elements that we are constantly subjected to and the more emotional elements. LP5's boundary-pushing elements are not only progressive for the electronic genre, but for any genre of music as well. When you're looking at the way that it shifts time, shifts tempo, the way that a lot of these tracks don't even have a set pulse. But at the same time, there are also moments that return to a strong sense of clarity. I think a lot of these themes of the mechanical and the emotional, which sort of nod to a lot of societal themes in my opinion, will be developed even further on their next record. But that being said, a lot of what they're doing here is still hitting on an intense, visceral level. You know, maybe a couple interludes in there that could be shaved off the track list, don't really add too much in terms of progression or momentum or intensity. Other than that, this is practically a perfect electronic masterpiece that should be held in the same regard as other fantastic projects of this genre, but there's still one better. The number one spot, which is 2001's Confield. If we were to say that LP5 pushes the boundaries of electronic music and any genre in general, I think in many ways, even though it's a similar sentiment, Confield pretty much pushes how sound can be expressed as an art form. What they're doing is essentially pushing music to its highest, its furthest boundaries, its highest limits, and they are just not stopping for a single second, because this is their most progressive album. This is their most interesting album, in my opinion, and definitely their most coherent, most cohesive album. It's an hour long, but as far as its 9 tracks goes, does not waste a single second. Before I get into the musical content of this record as well, I think that a lot of these elements paint a grim picture of, once again, a lot of the societal themes that I think they were kind of nodding towards on LP5, but now show the systems that we create on Confield. And I'll explain that by going through the track list as a whole. And starting with the opener, this feels like its own depiction of 2001: A Space Odyssey in a way. The metallic sounds sound a bit like the opening of that movie, The First Tool, and how it can be used in certain ways. But the more atmospheric elements of the track, they paint a picture of discovery. Fast forward to the second track, Sea Firm, which kind of sounds like we're in the jungle, but also at the same time maybe building some buildings in a village or something. It feels like we are, finally using technology and these tools to our own advantage. There's still an inherent instability there that will crash out later on the next track, Pan Express, which is just freaking insane. One of their best tracks in their entire discography, in my opinion. It has one of the best grooves on the album, but I don't even know if you can call it a groove. It's stuttering. At one point, it's just, there's no sense of pulse, even though there's an illusion of a pulse. A lot of the societal themes that I was talking about later, in terms of the first true major crash out of the system, just crushing under its own weight. And then you get into the reboot on the next track, and pretty much another reboot before we enter into the closer of this album as well. We also get tracks such as Sim Gisho, which I think demonstrate this concept on a more micro level. On one element, the syncopations on this track do sound like we are ahead of the curve, or in some ways progressing towards. And then once it starts to slowly back away and delay itself, it sounds like maybe we are not being as efficient as we could be in our intellectual processes and the systems that we are creating. I think it's just truly a masterpiece of electronic production, and will just completely throw you for a loop. But there you go. There's my Autechre discography. It was good to finally come back and do a video since the last Charlie XCX review, which you guys liked quite a bit. It's good to finally get back on here and talk to myself for a little bit, and it was fun going through the Autechre discography. If you haven't checked it out already, highly recommend it. Once again, let me know what your ranking would be in the comments. If there's any albums you want me to review, any more recent albums, or any classic albums. I do whatever on this channel. Occasionally like talking to you guys about stuff that I'm passionate about, and I hope you can leave a like, subscribe, comment if you like the video, comment if you're into Autechre as well. I'd love to discuss it. But with that being said, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.